Hello, welcome everyone who is joining us today for the remote working landscape, Rural Oregon's new opportunities and challenges. We're thrilled to have you here today.
Sure.
I want to introduce you to Rural Development Initiatives for those who haven't heard
During
of.
session, that's a tough thing, that's for sure.
I think we need somebody to do mute.
All right, great, thanks. Actually, now we have a free afternoon. It's wonderful. Thanks.
Okay, moving right along.
Whoops, Jennifer, it looks like you're on mute.
Okay. All right. Let's start over. Okay. Welcome everyone. I'm happy to have you here today. On behalf of Rural Development Initiatives, welcome to the remote working webinar that we're hosting today. The session will last about an hour. And so we're going to move pretty quickly into the body of, or the meat of the presentation today. For those who are not familiar with Rural Development Initiatives, we are an organization that has worked in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho for over 28 years. We provide programs in rural leadership development, economic vitality, and public policy. So, let's see. When, as part of the presentation today, just a few housekeeping details. Please make sure that you stay muted when you're not speaking. Please use the chat feature for any questions or comments or links that you'd like to provide. We do have a nice crew joining us today, and so I anticipate a lot of good questions, and I just want to assure you that we're going to get to as many as we can. The other tip I can give you is in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, there is a way for you to change to speaker view. And if you want to make sure that you can see the person who is speaking, that might be a change that you want to make in your configurations. The next thing I want to do is present a little bit of background information on some information that we've gleaned about remote working trends. Part of RDI's mission is to affect systems change by understanding public policy initiatives that impact rural places and by facilitating conversations about rural issues to encourage civic engagement. So one issue that has emerged over the last year is a consideration of how rural places might be impacted by an increase in remote work. So to that end, we've assembled a great group of panelists today to explore that question further and to help rural communities think about what actions might be taken to support remote workers and what challenges might arise. At this time, I'd like to introduce Taylor Sarman. Taylor is a member of RDI's board and also serves as the Director of Government Relations for Columbia Public Affairs. We're happy to have him help us moderate the session today, and I'm going to turn it over to him to introduce our panelists and take it away. Thank you, Taylor.
Great, well, thanks, Jennifer, and thanks to everyone who's joining us. It's great to see so many familiar names and faces joining for this panel. You know, telework is a relatively new buzzword in economic development and our workforce conversations, but today we're going to discuss what it might mean for rural economies and how we might go about encouraging it in a way that would create more vital rural communities. So we have lots of ground to cover today and a great group of panelists. So I want to jump in really quick and have them all share their expertise and experience on today's topic. So with that, I want to dive right into introductions. We're lucky to have Matt Dunn, who's the Executive Director of the Center on Rural Innovation, joining us today, and Rebecca Dilge, who's the Rural Community and Outreach Manager for the Utah Governor's Office of Economic Development, Jeff Madasha, who is the Operations Excellence Director for the Utah Office of Management and Budget, Paul Recanazone, who's the General Manager of Beacon Broadband Incorporated, and John Oden, who's the Senior Strategist at Civic Actions. And I'll also note that John is the author of the book, Distributed Teams, The Art and Practice of Working Together, Why Physically Apart, which just recently released a second edition. So very timely to the conversation that we're gonna dive in today. So a virtual thank you to all of the panelists for joining us this afternoon. So with that, let's just dive right into the questions. I know this is gonna be a great conversation. And the first question is actually for Matt. So Matt, the Center on Rural Innovation has really been a leader in helping rural communities understand how to develop their local digital economy. And I'm curious, what trends have you seen over the past year? And really, what advice do you have for rural communities that want to attract more remote workers?
Well, Taylor, thank you. And thank you for including us. And thank you for putting together a great panel of some old friends who I've been learning from over the years, like John and others, and folks that I know their work across the region. So, rural is having a moment, and it's a really interesting one. And it's not all great, right? The pandemic has disproportionately impacted rural places on a variety of fronts, whether it's hitting our already strapped healthcare institutions very hard, or disproportionately impacting the jobs that are currently in rural, that were more susceptible to a pandemic-like shutdown, and the automation that is coming roaring along with it, with both the desire to have more efficient ways to be able to deliver goods and services, but also in trying to keep human contact away from each other. I live in Vermont, where we're sometimes known for skiing, at least on the East Coast, and the ski area is all opened. The difference is that there isn't anyone selling tickets. There's no humans at booths selling tickets. It's all automated. And I'll tell you, the folks that I've talked to who have bought their ticket online and gone straight to the chairlift are not going back. And so there's going to be a big shift that takes place. On the other side there is a real movement of people who have decided that they can live where they want to live. And for some people, that's in a city, and they love being in a city, and they're not going to move from a city. But for many, that meant going to places where they had the outdoor amenities, they had the family, they had the type of weather, whatever it was that drew them to that place. And we're seeing it happen by leaps and bounds. Some data showed that in the 2 months after the pandemic, particularly technologists, people in careers that were technologists, but independent technologists, saw a massive movement for where they were saying they were living in urban before to rural. We're seeing housing spikes go through the price spikes going through the roof. The numbers coming out of Zillow are pretty remarkable. I don't think we've really experienced anything quite like this in this short a time period. And some of that's going to be so that people have a refuge, but some of it's going to be long-term and permanent. And then the folks at LinkedIn, while they don't do an urban-rural divide, have seen their membership go from 10% saying they're working remotely to 60%. And while they assume that it will come back down, their assumption is it's still going to be a multiple of where it was before. And that's just a fundamental shift in our country. So I think there is a rural moment right now, but we have to seize it. And there are a few things that we believe are critical. One is you got to get on top of the broadband. Right. And we're fortunate that in many parts of our country, rural folks have just rolled up their sleeves and found creative ways for bringing fiber internet to the home. And they've gone and done it. And they've used municipal electric companies. They've used co-ops. They've used new communication union districts that are hybrids of municipal entities. They've even had entrepreneurs who have crowdsourced in Kansas to build their own, and to do so in a way that was more efficient and locally owned, but through a completely private mechanism. And then all the public-private partnerships in between. So we know it can be done. There's clearly a commitment from the federal government to help achieve that. Hopefully it's going to be not just with money, but with policy to make it possible. And that's just going to make a huge difference. But any focus that you've had on it should be quadruply built on, because it is critical to be able to seize this time. The other things that are important are making sure you're making a community welcoming. This is, sometimes change in rural communities is hard, and you need to be able to bob and weave with new entrants to be a part of that community. And you also need to be thinking about different kinds of jobs that are going to be more resilient in the future. We're really focused on building digital economy ecosystems so you can have quality jobs that pay well, that are the benefit of automation, not the victims of automation, and make sure that, because right now, 15% of the nation's workforce is in rural, but only 5% of the digital jobs. And we think that for equity in terms of economic mobility, that number needs to go from 5 to 15%, but also for resilience, because automation is certainly not going to slow down. And we want to make sure that the recovery from this, this current pandemic-driven crisis is equitable across geography. Remote work is a big piece of that, but you got to make sure that you've got and then the final piece, Taylor, is you got to create the places and spaces, right? This is not going to be the same kind of setup that maybe we've been used to in the past, or as more and more, sprawl development has been coming to rural places. The exciting moments are when you can create density with, loft apartments in cool rural downtowns and co-work spaces, so that you can create community even if you're working in a distributed way. And then, the cultural amenities to help bring people together. We do believe that at some level, the real core to rural economic development are the 3 Bs, which are broadband, blues, and beer. And if you can bring those together, you can actually create that energy and dynamic to make it happen. And so, but we need to be proactive about that. And then we need to share the narrative. And we've been doing a lot of work at the Center on Rural Innovation, doing short films about extraordinary places like Cape Girardeau, Missouri, or Durango, Colorado, or Wilson, North Carolina, to get the word out about the extraordinary communities that are out there and ready to be a part of an inclusive economic revival.
That's great. Thanks, Matt, for sharing that. I've heard of broadband and beer, but blues, that's a new one. So excited that I now know that. And I think you were really talking about, we've got to change in some ways the way that we're used to doing things. And I think that is just such a great segue to bring John into this conversation to talk about your work around distributed economic development, and really the focus on incentives for humans and not corporations. So really curious, John, what can you share with us about how remote workers make decisions about where to live, and how that gets tied into distributed economic development in your perspective?
Sure, 2 things. And hello, everybody. Hi. Know that this has been going on before COVID. Like, COVID is now a big thing and everyone's talking about it. And so a lot of people are paying attention, but there's actually been trends going on in society already for this before COVID. Couple of quick ones. Millennials became the largest segment of the US workforce in 2016. Gen Z, come after millennials, become the second biggest segment of the US workforce sometime right about now, end of 2020, beginning 2021. Those 2 segments are digital natives. iPhones always existed, streaming video on your phones always existed. A job for life never existed. So they do not relocate for a job. Average tenure in a job is 4 years across all industries, all generations. It's 2 years specifically for tech people, under 2 years actually. I say all that to say people are not relocating for jobs. Note 1, this is before COVID. Note 2, if you have a location where you say, hey, we have 80% of the town works for one company, you've got an all eggs in one basket economy. If that one company goes bang or moves out of town or goes away, everyone in town is in real trouble. Even the 20% who never worked there are also in trouble. So from an economic stability point of view, what's really important is to do what you've been told to do for your own lives: diversify your revenue. So if you can diversify the revenue stream of your community by having people work for different companies while they still all live in your community, now you're onto something. So this is the distributed economic development. The Vermont remote worker law is the first statewide one that I know of. There's been work that's been done in Utah as well. So Jeff and I can't see them in the top. Rebecca, there she is also going to be talking about that too. But there's a few important angles here. You encourage people who each have different reasons for wanting to live somewhere. Like when I talk about the Vermont scenario to people, some people are like, oh, that's really cool because they love skiing or they love mountain biking. Other people think it's terrible because they love surfing or they love scuba diving. And it's like, well, it depends on what you're into in your own life as to whether you want to live in Vermont or if you want to live in Hawaii because they've just started a similar type of incentive program, or you want to live in Costa Rica, who's working on one. So where is important to you? You can choose wherever you can live wherever you choose, and still have a meaningful career. That's an important step. Two, to something that riffing on what Matt said, you need a place where you can professionally work. And so creating, saying, oh, just go work from home, isolation is not good for humans. We need contact. So having people working from a neighborhood co-working space in your small town, creating a co-working space that become a professional place to do calls like this from your town. And you also get to rub shoulders with other people in the neighborhood who get to see that they too could get jobs working just like you can. That's really important. And then the third one is that having the community accept, it's kind of weird. You got these new people coming into town, like, why are they here? It's change. Well, if they're showing up and they're using this as a place to flee the city because of the plague, right? And they're going to leave right away. They're causing disruption. They're upsetting how things were, and then they're leaving. It's not a helpful thing. If they're actually coming in as part of a new community, that's actually constructive and positive. And so having people in the community knowing about the spaces, knowing how the spaces are helping them find jobs online too, and having both sides working together as part of that transition and merge, that's a really important part of it. That community aspect is essential. Otherwise it becomes this us and them divide and it doesn't work at all. And then people leave and it's all upsetting. And you end up with a distributed economy because everyone's doing working for different employers. So you have a stable economy. So you can pay for schools, parks, hospitals, road repairs, all that stuff.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that, John. I mean, I know, especially with your work in Vermont, one of the things working in Oregon politics and around the legislature, I hear folks say all the time, we don't want to be the first to do it. We want somebody else to go out and do this, and we'd love to be the second or the third. Yep. Which actually feeds in really great to our friends from Utah who have kind of also ventured out on this path around telework incentives. So I want to bring you, Rebecca, and Jeff into this conversation as well. Utah's developed and implemented a number of really innovative initiatives to encourage telework and the conversations that we're having right now. So would love to hear you both talk about, what aspects of these programs have been most successful in Utah. And then, what would you tell leaders in Oregon that we should be doing to incentivize remote work?
Well, I'm not going to tell the leaders in Oregon to do anything. I promise.
I'll probably appreciate that, Rebecca.
Thank you very much for this invitation to come, and we are really honored to be here. Interestingly enough, since 2018, our legislature put together a package to begin the opportunities for remote work and job creation in rural Utah. And it's been known as a three-legged stool. And the three pieces, or the three legs to this stool that I'm going to talk about. Now, Jeff has got a whole nother program that the state is doing. So I'll speak to this one specifically and let Jeff address his. It is a rural economic development incentive, which gives grant money between $4,000 and $6,000 for each new position created in rural Utah. Now, we're talking remote telework, but this can be any position in the rural communities. And the businesses can be in the rural community, or it can be along our metropolitan Wasatch Front. The businesses can even be in Oregon, interestingly enough. The intent of this incentive is actually job creation in rural Utah. 2018, we weren't thinking so quite as much about telework as we are today. We were getting there. So this was a piece of that, was where are the opportunities that we can create any kind of important job, high paying position. So we don't cater to like the retail industry. So we've got your online customer service is okay, but if we're marketing or selling, then Utah's been specific. It's just not for anything and everything. They're specific to the industry, but it's pretty much any industry other than retail, staffing and service, construction, and public utilities. And this program has been a great tool to start the conversation. And even more so this last year, we've had companies coming to us, knocking on our doors saying, tell us about this READY grant, the acronym, of course, we do that in government. What can we do, or how can we help promote or encourage or support the state in its effort for teleworking and remote rural jobs? And interesting stats on this is that we have companies that say, well, we're going to create 25 jobs, but honestly, maybe only 2 of them are the high paying positions. So our grant is only maybe paying $12,000, $6,000 for each position. We will pay up to $250,000 per fiscal year, which is very attractive. And that, pricks the interest for these businesses. But eventually, sometimes it's that either all those positions are high paying or maybe just a couple are, but it's still bringing job creation to the rural communities. A second leg to this stool is a Rural Co-working and Innovation Center grant. So this is a competitive grant, and we have it available for communities that are in the rural areas where, we do have really good broadband in the state of Utah. There has been great effort to use the federal dollars through our education and telehealth. We've connected our anchor institutions, and we, are just working on the last percentages of getting good broadband to everyone across the state. In those areas, though, in the rural communities where maybe to a home, perhaps, or maybe the working conditions at home aren't the best, this grant provides an opportunity to have this co-working space. So we have, it is a competitive grant. This last year we had $750,000. We had a number of applicants, and we have 10 total of the last 2 years that have applied, and it pays for equipment, it will pay for furniture, pays for any infrastructure, utilities of any kind, including the broadband. So this gives a place within a community has in a rural area, but maybe has a little bit more population, and a location where people don't have to go hours and hours to commute, but a closer location and not have to work out of their home if that doesn't work. Now, the third leg to the stool is our Rural Online Initiative. And we also have Paul Hill on here. He is the director. He's an associate, he's a professor and works with the Utah State University Extension. And this Rural Online Initiative, if you have any specific questions for him, is really great. It was funded and is ongoing funding now because it has been so successful, and is providing training for individuals on how to work online. So it's a different experience. And for those of us that were not working at home that much or not at all, to suddenly, well, how do I do this? How do I communicate? How do I connect? What about cybersecurity? What is the best way to report to a manager? They have had this program for the rural communities the last couple of years at no cost. It's a 4-week program, And then they have recently, this last year, started a program for managers. To date, they have 91 organizational leaders that have completed the Remote Work Leader course. So once they established the program to train people how to work online, then they pivoted and now are including a manager, how to help people how to run their employees remotely. They've had over 1,300 students that have completed this course. They are doing it right now. They are offering, at a discount. It's like $20 for people in the rural communities. Anyone can take this course though. Okay, Paul, correct me if I'm wrong. Anyone can take it. It's about $100. Is that right? For anyone to take this course. And I think they were going to throw a link into the chat so you can access their website. And they are proud to report 169 professional course students have reported employment success stories. So they not only train them, but they have a network of employers who are ready to hire these individuals. That's it for our three-legged stool, our incentive programs. And Jeff.
Thanks, Rebecca. And thanks everyone for having me. Jeff Monisheim with the Governor's Office of Management and Budget in the state of Utah. And my part in this was to roll out a enterprise-wide teleworking program to the state of Utah's executive branch agencies. So instead of asking the private sector to be the teleworkers and incentivize moving to the rural parts of the state, we wanted to lead out and create a program that would work not only for the private sector, but in government sector as well, and show that it could be done. A few others in the country have done this, but really we wanted to lead by example. And one of our main goals was to see if we could create jobs in rural Utah by allowing good paying state jobs to be done remotely. In the first 18 months of the program, we're happy to report that we had 207 people working state jobs in rural Utah that we didn't have when we started. So that's been exciting. I think what's most exciting about it, though, is we're showing how even in a complicated government setting, that remote work and distributed working can be successful, not only just barely successful, but highly successful. And so as we're moving forward, it's gaining even more traction with our new administration. They're looking at ways to increase even the number of eligible services, things that can be done remotely. So some of the comments that we've had already about automation and things, the culture is shifting and people aren't expecting so many in-person services. So that's exciting for our teleworking efforts and the positive outcomes that can be for rural parts of our state. We've had an interesting situation in Utah. We have super low unemployment rates. And so we were fighting with the private sector for talented employees along our Wasatch Front over and over again, while we had talented employees in the rest of the state. And so this has really opened up opportunities also for state agencies to bring in talented employees and allow them the opportunities to stay where they'd like to across the state. So great stuff happening.
That's great. Thank you, Jeff and Rebecca. I particularly love when we can highlight, government leading the way and really being innovative in terms of policy. And Rebecca, really appreciated you talking about both the incentive and then also the training component as well, because that, in our conversations in Oregon, those are the two things we've heard the most is training, but then also infrastructure, which probably leads really great into our next speaker to talk a little bit about that as well. So Paul, I'm curious, we know that the broadband infrastructure piece is just a vital component of this conversation, and in a lot of ways, the starting point. So I'm curious to get your perspective, what barriers are you grappling with right now in terms of improving broadband services in rural Oregon?
Taylor, thank you very much for that question, and thank you for allowing me to be part of the panel. I do feel a substantial burden of being the only Oregon resident on the panel, and so I feel it's hypercritical for me to step up and make sure that I represent our state effectively.
No pressure.
Yeah, thanks. As we look at developing broadband in Coos and Curry counties where Beacon Broadband is resident, we've been studying this for 2 or 3 years. Coos Curry Electric Cooperative is the single owner of Beacon Broadband. And Coos Curry has been looking at the need to expand broadband infrastructure, just as 83 years ago, Coos Curry looked at the need to expand electrical infrastructure. And in so doing, one of the key barriers that we run up against is the key barrier that all rural broadband developers run into. The cost per household passed is substantial. We're going to make more revenue. We're going to have better success in our more populated areas like Brookings and Port Orford, where we are competing with 2 other very reasonable broadband providers, and we're going to be getting a significantly lower take rate because of that competition. In spite of that significantly lower take rate, we'll have a better sustainable project in those areas than we will in our more rural areas, where we drop down to 10 or 7 households per mile. And just the brute cost of carrying the fiber through all of that rural area where there is no opportunity for revenue off of the infrastructure that we're putting into place is one of the huge barriers that we face. Many organizations have elected to overcome that barrier by using fixed wireless or other alternative distribution mechanisms for broadband. I feel very fortunate that the Coos Curry Electric Cooperative Board of Directors said no. If we can't get equitable service to all of our members, we don't want to be in the business at all. And so that speaks in part to one of the things that Matt brought up earlier in the conversation when he asked the question of how does it get done, and across the nation, it's getting done by people simply rolling up, recognizing the need and rolling up their sleeves and doing it. We've rolled up our sleeves at Coos Curry and Beacon Broadband, and we're going to do it, but the effort to get it done is huge and the cost to get it done is huge. So to expect a private company to be able to expand service to all of our most remote members, to extend the high-speed fiber experience where no one else will go, is an unrealistic expectation. And if Coos Curry Electric Cooperative wanted to get into the broadband business as a high revenue generating opportunity, it would be a foolish decision. Again, when the electric cooperative was looking at the opportunity to get into this line of business, one of the questions was not how are we going to make a lot of money off of this, but rather how are we going to break even at this? Because this is an essential service for our members. And so part of the struggle with developing broadband in rural America and in rural Oregon in particular is just finding an organization or a set of organizations with the willpower to say, this is not going to be a huge money-making venture, but this is a venture that's essential to our members. So the idea of using cooperatives, the idea, the work that's been done in Vermont and a couple of other northeastern states to create new specialized types of districts to be able to band together and to bring a group of people who recognize the need together to resolve that need is an essential element. Another element that is incredibly difficult for us to overcome, I remember I was working a project in Eastern Colorado. And as I was working out, it's most of the time when we think of Colorado, we think of the Rocky Mountains and the huge mountains, but Eastern Colorado is very much a plains state. And while we were working out there, there was another broadband provider who had a series of commercials called The Settlers. And the concept is here they are washing their clothes with their washer board, and the next door neighbor has a washing machine. And the kids would say, Dad, why can't we do that? And the dad would say, we're pioneer stock, we're settlers, and we don't need any of that. And the concept was, we don't need that extra broadband, we're settlers. And so one of the things that we have to overcome in rural Oregon, and I believe probably in all of rural America, is that idea that what we have is good enough. We've gotten by with it for this long, we'll continue to get by with it. So the education opportunities that Rebecca talked about with the Rural Online Initiative are an incredibly important part of the work that we're trying to do to overcome the barriers to distributing broadband in rural Oregon. The final element that I'd like to touch bases on with as far as a barrier to deploying broadband in incorporated cities, you've got public utility rights of way for that you can build your fiber in. In rural America, we cross private property. With the cooperative, we cross private property with the power lines. With the broadband, we're going to have to cross private property in order to provide service to our members and to the folks that we want to get service to. And so we're facing a huge burden. We did an analysis of just the easements that we would have to require, that we have to acquire and update in order to bring broadband to all of our members. And the recording fees alone are projected to be at about $1 million. And we're going to need about 2,000 man days to complete the easement documents and to get the signatures on them. And so to be able to take care of the, I understand, and I don't want to be flippant about property rights. I understand how important property rights are, but we already have an easement on these properties for our electricity. It is a bureaucratic necessity for us to add the additional function of the broadband onto that existing easement. And that bureaucratic necessity is going to cost us $1 million and 2,000 man hours, and is going to flood our already overworked recording offices. So we're really fortunate right now, and for the 50 or so people that are listening, right now there is a bill before the legislature called House Bill 2654, which will allow the extension of the electrical easements to incorporate broadband. And so I need to just throw a pitch out right now to get you to support that legislation. And with that hard sell to support the legislation, Taylor, I'll stop talking.
No, that was really great, Paul, and I really appreciate it. I mean, you really highlighted, how labor intensive and the costs that are associated with this. And, that really gets me to this next question, particularly for folks who, are in the public policy space. The pandemic has demonstrated that folks are teleworking right now by the nature of having to. And so as we think about limited resources, would love to get this panel's input on, why do we still need incentives if folks are already doing this now? And, really, if folks could speak to that, I think that would be some great context.
I didn't see anyone else jumping in first, so I guess I'll start. Tag, you're it. Okay. I think there's a kind of a how do you start the wheel turning part here, and I think reporting and talking about what you're doing is important. So, for example, an incentive, and keep in mind what I call traditional economic development. An incentive to bring a company to a location, usually there's a lot of money in that. Like by the time you get into credits and actual direct cash, that's actually serious number of zeros going out in terms of money to a corporation to come to a location. It's funny, for smaller amounts of money, people quickly latch onto, why am I giving money to a human? Like, that's kind of like not the way it's supposed to be. It's, I think if you actually track it, so instead of giving, New York City was going to give Amazon $75,000 per job. That's a lot of money. Vermont is giving people up to $5,000 payments, right? It's a fraction of the money. So being clear on the numbers is one. Two, actually reporting back the improvements. So like starting to report things like, oh, we have extra sales tax now. The project that's going on in Remote Shoals in Alabama, in the Northwest Alabama area, they're using local community sales tax as a fund to incentivize people to move there. And then as people spend money, it re-tops up the fund. And that fund is actually then a circular fund, a rotating grant fund, if you want to call it that. I really like that model, but I think the important part is talking about it. They had to communicate that and talk about it in community meetings and explain it in council meetings and explain how this was to start the wheel turning and then become self-sufficient and revive the economy. I think that's the main part. And the second part is, I think even with a small amount of money, what you're really doing is signaling. You're indicating a willingness as a community to have other people move there and help bring some of these modern technology things. I travel all over the place. I have people in Australia and Canary Islands and some in Portugal who want to ask me about Vermont. Now, they actually couldn't find Vermont on the map, and they couldn't identify other states in the United States except New York and California, but they all had heard about Vermont. That's you couldn't pay for that kind of advertising. And the same is true across the US. So that's an important signaling thing. It makes it like people are welcomed. So the folks who do Tulsa do this. The folks who are doing Savannah, Georgia are doing this. Utah are doing this too. I think that's the secret to starting it.
I would say the next frontier, if I can jump in, is also making sure that that employers who have opened their aperture to this opportunity, in a bigger way. I mean, to John's point, they had already started mostly because of the demands of their top employees, but now are saying, oh, we can do this permanently. Zillow, who made the commitment to like be remote, for the long term. And I think the new frontier is to make sure that those incentives are aligned to continue that encouragement, particularly for more entry-level workers, right? For a long time, the remote work was usually, and John, you have the data better than I do, but it's usually someone who had already established themselves at a company or in a career trajectory, and so we're able to make, I don't know, a demand, I guess you could say. I mean, when I got recruited by Google and they wanted to know how soon I would move to Mountain View, California. And I said, never. And they eventually folded, but it was because I was already far along in my career. If we're going to make this part of an inclusive economy in the longer term, it's also about making sure that new entrants into jobs that can work remotely are able to do paid internships on a distributed basis, which for some reason in the tech world seems crazy, when in fact I know many computer interns who never met their supervisor in person, even when they were in the same city. So I think there are new steps that creative policymakers and others can embark on to further encourage this and to make that statement that John was talking about, which definitely has a real benefit for recruiting talent to your state, and these days that means recruiting the businesses eventually along with them.
If I could riff, and okay, Taylor said okay. I actually want to, like, to me, one of the things that's, we're talking here about people coming from out of state into the state, but also want to make sure people think that there's also people who are in the state, but in a different part of the state. So this is part of what Jeff was talking about, Jeff Motorshell was talking about earlier, where people who don't live in Salt Lake City are right in the middle around it, but who are perfectly qualified for the job. You'd love to have them work for you. They want a job, but they happen to live 200 miles away, still in the same state. Instead of being long-term unemployed, you could have an existing state resident now with a job. Oh, and by the way, they're then going out and buying sandwiches and coffees or whatever in the local coffee shop nearby. So this is not just from other states in, it's within the state as well. And I think the reason I mention that is government is actually in most places the largest employer, if you look at number of humans. And government has been talking about telework since the 90s, if not before. At least my research so far got as far as back as 1991, right after the 1989 earthquake. And telework from back then is very, very limited, marginal, and stuff you do at home. Now, of course, technology has moved along. Your phone is not wired to the wall of the house anymore. You carry it in your pocket. And, so you can change how you hire and recruit. And I really think there's a big deal of local government. I'm looking at everybody here who's in different forms of state and local government. If you could start saying, oh, our agency will start hiring people who live elsewhere in our own state. Like, you could do that right now using the existing technology you have right now. And you could start improving the economy across the state and improve your hiring pool, and also signal to others that this is a real thing. I'll stop. That's a call to action.
That's great. No, thank you, John. And I'm still trying to get over this notion of a phone connected to a wall or a cord. So that is a wild thing. But
yeah,
I do think, I really appreciated your context about the, interstate migration versus intrastate, and would love to hear from the folks from Utah, kind of about, where are you seeing these jobs coming from, really?
Maybe Taylor, I can take that just a little bit from our experience in our teleworking program. We started tracking way back in the beginning the zip code of the home address for all of the state employees, the 22,000 state employees that would be affected by this program. And we wanted to see if there was changes, right? Because we have, kind of like Colorado, we have the Wasatch Front where the bulk of our population lives. Cost of housing is going up and it's becoming problematic. We have air quality issues on top of, right, the higher unemployment rates in rural Utah. But we also had situations where people were leaving our rural cities to come to the Wasatch Front for work, right? So telework we saw as a way to try and help with all of that. And, originally the focus was hire people in those parts of the state, but right out of the gate, when people knew that this was for real and sticking around, not just kind of the flavor of the month, so to speak, we had people immediately begin selling their homes on the Wasatch Front and moving back to these parts of the state, either that they grew up in and they didn't think they'd be able to get back to till they were retired or whatever, but they're taking their families with them. Other people wanted that lifestyle that comes from smaller towns. They felt like they could provide a better lifestyle for their families. They could afford a better home, maybe more property, right? And some of the air quality issues, congestion issues, cost of living, all of that changed. So for a lot of our employees, they're seeing that as a huge benefit, even to the point where we'll probably be able to continue retaining people who otherwise would have left state government for higher paying jobs or other things. So for us, we've seen this as a win on a lot of fronts, but the bulk of the rural jobs have actually come from migration and not hiring in the rural parts of the state, although that is happening.
Taylor, if I could just maybe I can ask a question of the other panelists as well as provide a thought on this. Here on the south coast of Oregon, we're really pretty remote. I mean, the nearest airport for us is 2.5 hours from the either end. If you're in the middle of our region, you're 3 or 4 hours away from an airport. We don't have a lot of transportation capabilities. We can become isolated really very swiftly. And so as Beacon Broadband is looking at building broadband in the region, we don't really have a lot of hope that we're going to be attracting significant in-migration of other state workers. We believe that in-migration is going to largely happen as Portland expands out, and very much like the Wasatch Front or the Denver area, it's those communities that are within an hour or two of the metropolitan area that seem to be getting the best growth from doing some of these initiatives. Whereas here we are 4 or 5 hours away from our metropolitan center. So we're really hoping that by building broadband and by providing education about how to better use it, not only for your own business, but in your life, and expanding the fiber experience, not just the speed, but the entire experience, we're really hoping that we're going to be able to start spurring an entrepreneurial bent and start growing organically local businesses and creating new opportunities to, as John was talking about, greater diversify our economy and create opportunities for the people that live here and want to live here, whether or not someone in Portland wants to hire remotely. And if I could, I'd just like to hear if we're off base or if that looks like a realistic path to pursue.
I'll jump in here, if I may. So it's interesting that you mentioned that. I know where you are. My son actually went to Southwest Oregon Community College. I love that there. So broadband is key. You're right, Paul. You're hitting the nail on the head. If we build it, will they come? And truly, that's it. I work with the broadband in our state as well. And the state of Utah had an opportunity actually when we had the Winter Olympics, and they were able to get federal dollars to rebuild a lot of their highway systems. And not to say that you need to do an Olympics, but they continued with that. And when they rebuilt these systems, they laid their fiber optic and they put conduit down, and they have shared this conduit with the local providers. And they have agreements across the state with their local providers, and to share, the providers sometimes share their conduit with the state and vice versa. There's no dollars crossing hands there. It's just these agreements that they have worked out with each other. And UDOT has continued and used a lot of this CARES Act fund to lengthen and that fiber backbone into the rural areas, even more so. Also, our Utah Education and Telehealth Network is a state organization, and they go after federal E-rate dollars. And this funding connects the anchor institutions, so your schools, your healthcare, your hospitals, and they go after the grant. Once they're awarded the grant, then they put out an RFP to providers who then bid on that. It is the providers then who then are given that grant money to put in this middle mile. And then once they get this to the anchor institutions, then they can branch out and then are able to reach the rest of the households in the communities. So they will get to own that. UETN does not own that, that fiber. It is the broadband provider who is awarded the RFP that owns that. And then somebody put in the chat real quick, USDA. So USDA funds a lot of federal grants, and our rural providers have, many of them have jumped on that, whether it's the Reconnect, the Connect grant programs. And I know the RDOF just recently, and yes, we do have a lot of that went to Starlink, and I've seen a few chats in there about the Starlink. And their hope is that until you can get fiber broadband, look to Starlink, right? But fiber's key, and that is what has helped our communities the most to be able to have remote work. And if it were not for that, because I have actually, and I probably shouldn't admit this, but we have a company from Portland that has applied for the READY grant, and they said, we hear that Utah has really good broadband in the rural areas. And I said, yeah. So they had looked up to going into Montana, and they says, yeah, it's not so good up there. So we're looking Utah's direction.
Taylor, do you mind if I ask a follow-up question of Rebecca?
Please, Paul.
I had the great opportunity, Rebecca, of working in Utah for a little while, and you've got three extraordinary things that have happened with broadband in Utah. The first one is, as you talked about, UEA took advantage of the Recovery Act money in 2009 in an extraordinary way. And secondly, I can't remember her name, but the IT director for UDOT, who started that program of exchange, did some extraordinary work and set an exemplary program for other states across the nation, and that was fantastic. And she's done some great work sharing that. And then near and dear to my heart is the Utah Telecommunications Open Infrastructure Agency. The Utopia Projects is a model for creating open access infrastructure and built in rural areas and in urbanized areas throughout the state. So when Matt talks about rolling up your sleeves and just starting to build infrastructure and getting it done, Utah's pursued some significant paths to do that. The question, long lead into the question. The question that I would have for you and also for Jeff is, have you seen that that those fantastic efforts that Utah has taken to build broadband, have you seen organic growth of new entrepreneurial businesses in your rural communities from better broadband?
Paul, I'll take a first stab at that. I don't have any, scientific data to suggest that, but I do have quite a bit of anecdotal evidence from people that I've worked with, quite a number of them, even state employees. Their retirement plans include small online businesses and things like that. So I know I have a good friend, in fact, his whole retirement plan is he and his wife have a very robust Etsy store, which I had to learn what that was. But, so those types of things are very important. I know that a lot of state employees are looking at those community college areas, state college areas, because they know the broadband infrastructure to those cities and towns is robust, and they would have reliable internet services. I think it's interesting your comment about airports, because we're seeing people that are 4 or 5 hours away from airports and moving there without concern, I guess, for that airport. So I guess from an employee perspective, unless they travel quite a bit, the airport might not be as big of an issue as it would be for, say, a business or a typical business. Just some thoughts. We have some parts that are probably 6 to 8 hours away from the nearest airport, and people are still migrating there with their state jobs.
Well, something that we always say at the Center on Rural Innovation is that broadband is necessary but not sufficient. It's really necessary, right? You can't even get started if you don't have world-class broadband. But then you do need to get to the so what of broadband, especially if you want to create a true digital economy ecosystem in a place. And even if people are working, largely from home, it's important to have some place that they want to go to, in the evening or for lunch, and to engage with folks. And so those things are important to recognize and invest in as well. But the other part is just getting the word out about broadband. I can't tell you how often we go around the country and people assume that everyone in rural America is still, on a Dixie cup and string, right? It's not, and it's not the case. That's why we talk about how many folks, and organizations like yours have just pioneered getting this done, and that it is real and it's out there. Because once they realize that they can get faster broadband with your fiber than they can get in downtown San Francisco or New York City, they just think completely differently about it. And so I would just say that it's critical to get that word out, and not just to the regional customer base, but to a broader base. And then a lot of the work that we do, which is a subject for a different conversation, which is building digital economy ecosystems and intentionally creating accelerators and co-work spaces with a supportive remote work, and finding ways to bring early stage capital to scalable tech companies also needs to happen. But it is all contingent on having the electricity of our time, which is broadband.
Yeah. And if I can, Tyler, just before Taylor jumps, one other thing I'd add to that too is a variation on the question that Paul to Jeff. There are people who are not entrepreneurs. Humans like that exist, they do. And so it's important to keep in mind there are people who just want a job and get paid for it and do good work, etc. Which is, and so part of providing these spaces, whether you call them innovation hubs or neighborhood community co-working centers, whatever you call them, providing a place where people can go and meet other people and see that they too could get a job as an accountant working online, working for some firm, or as a lawyer. Those are things that most people don't think are even possible until they see their new neighbors doing it, and they want to know how they can do it as well. I think that to me is a really important enabler, and that's the magic of this. I think that is really important. It's across all of these sectors. And I know we're running up on time, but I want to give a shout specifically out to Paul. One of the things I thought that Paul Hill that did really well with this is they actually call out, here's all this training program, And then if you want to, in your local community or university, if you want to do a version of this, they'll help you. And there's a bunch, and I can't remember the names, but Paul can probably list them off the top of his head. There's a bunch of places already doing a kind of a white label version of what Paul and his group set up. So if that's of interest to you, and you want to do something like that in Oregon, or there's other places here too, talk to Paul. I thought that was very clever.
That's great. Thank you, John. I know we are at time. I know we all have other Zoom meetings probably to get to, but do want to just really appreciate and share my appreciation with all of our panelists that we've had today. I mean, clearly just so much expertise on this topic. And I've heard, you know, we probably could do a webinar for each one of these panelists. So maybe that'll be our follow-up. So be on the lookout for this conversation 2.0. But with that, I want to turn it over to Jennifer from the RDI team to close us out and get us on with our day.
Great, thank you, Taylor. And thank you very much to all of our panelists. I think we suspected this would not be enough time to cover this topic, but we're glad to introduce it. And what we thought we'd do is some of the questions we haven't gotten in the chat we'll send to our panelists and see if we can email you some answers from them as part of the discussion. So also wanted to acknowledge the fact that the Ford Family Foundation is providing funding for this presentation today. So thank you to them for that. And if you want more information about RDI, you can check out our website. This is the first of 6 community conversations. And for those of you who are interested, we'll be putting in the chat information about the one on March 31st, which is related to how the Oregon legislature is focusing on rural public policy. So we'll send you an email about that as well. So I just want to thank everyone for coming. A big thank you to our panelists and all the good information that's been provided in the chat. We're grateful to all of you for being involved with our conversation today, and I hope you have a lovely day. Bye.
Thank you all.